Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes, and this is the story of our virtual world, a history of the MMORPG, Part 4. Meet Richard Garriott, a games designer from Cambridge, England. Back in 1981, Richard had created and released one of the very first RPG computer games ever, Ultima. Ultima, or to give it the full title, Ultima 1: The First Age of Darkness, released to critical praise and is now widely considered to be one of the most important role-playing games ever made. It was the first computer game to have an open world, allowing players to travel wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Richard would release Ultima 2: The Revenge of the Enchantress only a year later, meeting with the same critical praise and positive reviews. Richard would then work hard and go on to release Ultima 3: Exodus, 4: Quest of the Avatar, 5: Warriors of Destiny, 6: The False Prophet, 7: The Black Gate, 7 Part 2: The Serpent Isle, and 8: Pagan. If there was one developer who knew the role-playing game genre inside out, it was Richard Garriott. The Ultima series was world famous and high quality, but it wasn't online, and Richard knew he had to change this. In September of 1997, Richard Garriott did two very important things. First, he released Ultima Online. Second, he described the game as a massively multiplayer, online, role-playing game. And with that, the MMORPG acronym was born. And from his gaming throne, Lord British, Richard Garriott's in-game avatar, sat back and watched the show. Richard had founded the development company Origin Systems, which was then bought up by Electronic Arts in 1992. It was then proven that Electronic Arts at the time had no idea how popular Ultima Online would be. The company believed sales would be low, and EA president at the time, John Riccitiello, publicly said that Ultima was never a big franchise. Between launch on September 25th and November the 13th, Ultima Online sold 65,000 units, with reports that the 5,000 units sent to Japan sold out in the first 15 minutes. Ultima Online would go on to hold the Guinness World Record for first MMORPG to reach 100,000 players. The game itself was technically solid, with a bird's-eye isometric camera view and click-to-move controls. Players could explore the fantasy world, fight enemies, loot bosses, or attempt to kill other players. The world was vast, and all established conventions were followed. Game on the left, info on the right. The visible equipment window, inspired by Tibia, featuring prominently. The game wasn't without controversy. One of its main selling points was player freedom, pushing toward the sandbox game design. Because of this, players were able to attack other players freely, with only the swift revenge of other players to act as a deterrent. This dangerous world divided players, those in favour of player versus player combat and those against. As the game aged, updates would include large sections of the world where player versus player combat was banned, with the Renaissance expansions bringing a huge amount of safe content. Ultima Online would ultimately prove a success and go on to be known as a mainstay of the online world. However, while it did take the lessons of the past and do everything better than anyone else had done it, it still failed to break into the mainstream market. Despite the immense prestige of Ultima, it wasn't the global success it could have been. But this, I feel, is not the game's fault. home gaming systems such as the PlayStation 1 were taking off, and with other releases in the year, including GoldenEye for the N64 and Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, gaming companies were pushing hard toward the console market, and niche online games about dragons and knights didn't have the same broad appeal as Lara Croft. Richard Garriott had named the genre, given it the best, most successful game it had seen so far, yet it still wasn't enough. With Ultima Online out, game companies were hesitant to enter the MMORPG market, and it would be several more months before another franchise would emerge. Online games in general were growing in popularity, and website mplayer.com hosted some of the more popular ones, including the first-person shooter Quake and the real-time strategy game Command & Conquer. Developers Lyra Studios believed the world was ready for another MMORPG and planned to take on Ultima Online. They would create a first-person MMORPG with a fully rendered 3D environment, full player versus player combat, and host it on mplayer.com. They had the lofty goal of making the MMORPG, the one that everyone would play and everyone would enjoy. The only small hurdle was Lyra Studios had never made a game before. A video game is tough to make, an MMORPG even more so. There are endless things that can go wrong, and with industry veteran Richard Garriott failing to take over the world with Ultima Online, what hope would a small, new studio have? Lyra Games ignored all warnings and released Underlight. Wikipedia describes it as a first-person graphical MUD, but as the industry now gave the genre a name, we can use its real descriptor, MMORPG. Being a first-person game with emphasis on player versus player combat, Underlight featured larger, more detailed character models, the trade-off in processing power being each individual game area, referred to as rooms, was much smaller. Many rooms made up a plane. Roleplay within the game was strictly enforced and contains no other non-playable characters other than enemy monsters. No shopkeepers, no citizens of the world, only players. The most powerful enemies in the game were actually controlled by players. An interesting twist. People controlling the monsters were, however, unable to communicate with the regular human players. When players died, they would lose experience, drop a random item from their inventory onto the ground, and become a ghostly floating orb. They would then have to return to a central safe area before they could be revived. In a very controversial decision, a spell was added into the game that would allow a player to permanently kill another player. This skill was extremely rare and hard to acquire, but the very idea of a permanent character killing in-game ability is not a game mechanic that has ever been repeated, for good reason. Underlight was not a bad game, and although being hosted alongside famous games like Quake and Command & Conquer, it also failed to break into the cultural zeitgeist and was ultimately relegated to fade into obscurity. Side note, Underlight found a second wind in 2018 when it released on Steam, and is still played by a small but dedicated fanbase today. 1 month later, in April 1998, the Korean MMORPG Baram would complete its English language localization and, under the direction of developer Jake Song, released to the North American audience as Nexus: Kingdom of the Winds. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. and the industry had moved on. Nexus had respectable graphics 2 years ago, but by now, Ultima Online and Meridian 59 had shown gamers what MMORPGs could truly be, and Nexus also fell into the void of forgotten games. 5 months after Nexus released to the North American audience, the next major MMORPG contender would enter the arena. Korea had given us Baram, or Nexus Kingdom of the Winds. Now, Korea would establish itself as a serious player in the MMORPG industry. Jake Song, the developer behind Nexus, was already working on his next project, an isometric MMORPG aiming to dethrone Ultima Online. Emerging developer NC Soft had been working on a fantasy MMO, and they would release it worldwide on the same day, becoming available to the Korean, Japanese, European, and American market. The game was based on a Korean comic book series and released on September 3rd, 1998 as Lineage. Lineage was another isometric fantasy online game, borrowing character and enemy inspiration heavily from both Dungeons & Dragons and the older single-player game NetHack. The gameplay was similar to what we already knew, but Lineage introduced the morality system. The Dungeons & Dragons board game allows players to choose an alignment, a broad general sense of overall morality. Lineage allowed players to exist on a sliding scale, from lawful through neutral to chaotic, and NPCs, such as enemies or city guards, would react differently to you depending on your current alignment. Chaotic players would be attacked on sight by guards of friendly cities and often other players. Player versus player combat was rife in Lineage, as a core section of the gameplay was based around player-run castles. Owning a castle would allow the player or groups of players to set tax limits on the surrounding cities. If you as a player wished to attack a castle, you first had to join a group of other players, called a blood pledge. A blood pledge could attempt to siege a castle or go to war against a rival blood pledge. It is here we see the first forming of official clans or guilds. MMORPG players have been forming clans and guilds since the days of Neverwinter, but Lineage included it as a major part of the gameplay. Developer NC Soft would remember this guild aspect of the game, and it would heavily influence their next title. NC Soft would report Lineage went on to reach 3 million subscribers and over its lifetime would gross $1.8 billion. Lineage was immensely successful in the Korean market due to the fact it was developed by Jake Song of Nexus fame and how it was based on a Korean comic book. Gaming companies now saw the Eastern market as a major source of revenue, and MMORPG developers knew that if they wanted maximum sales, they would have to appeal to the Korean, Japanese, and Chinese markets. Lineage was by all metrics a success, but it still wasn't the gaming industry big breakout moment, the single game that would put MMORPGs on the map. That would come 6 months later, in March of 1999. Cambridge University in England, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the world. It was here that one student was working late into the night designing his own fantasy world. The plan was, if you can't go bigger, go broader. Andrew Gower was writing and coding an online game so lightweight it would run on virtually any computer, and in 1999 he released DeviousMUD. The best part it didn't require any download. The entire game was coded using the programming language Java, which allowed all essential game files to be loaded directly from an internet browser. With the home computer market growing rapidly, not everyone had one. The easiest way to find a computer was in your school or local library. Shared public computers often had blocks or bans against downloading programs. You couldn't install any files without the administrator's permission, and most online games required at least some small download. DeviousMUD avoided this, and being the simplest and most direct MMORPG playable on public computers, began to spread. The graphics were extremely basic. The sprites or trees or NPC guards looked clunky and childish compared to the more realistic offerings of Ultima Online or the stylized looks of Nexus. But they did hold a certain simple charm. DeviousMUD focused on its simplicity, allowing anyone to create a character, play the game, and have their progress saved automatically when they logged out. Then all they had to do was log in again, even from a different computer, and continue playing their game. This ease of access was a major selling point. No longer did you need to buy or download anything. If you had access to the internet at all, you had access to DeviousMUD. The tiny size of the game meant it only required an internet connection speed of 0.3 kilobytes a second, which was achievable by all home internet at the time. DeviousMUD is an important step on our MMORPG journey, not because of what it is now, but because of what it will become. It had the reach and the player base. It would just need a few more years to truly become something amazing. While DeviousMUD was aiming at the lower-end PC and slow internet demographic, it was about to face competition from the extreme other side. If you had a good computer, fast internet, and wanted a more serious online game, your prayers were about to be answered. The world was about to be conquered. The first MMORPG king was about to be crowned. Thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying this fantastic journey. If you want to support this series and channel, you can help out by simply liking, commenting, subscribing or sharing. A big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon who have made this whole thing possible. If you'd like to become a patron, the links are in the description. See you in the next video, and as always, have a great day.